Hi, I'm Dan Music. If you're not sure you want to fix your springs because of the dangers, this video is for you. We show you how to wind the springs with a drill rather than with winding bars.
Step up the ladder and remove the vice grip. Slide the shaft as needed to remove the ends from the bearings. Lower the tube to the floor. Place the tube next to the door to avoid the risk of it rolling under your feet and causing an injury or accident. Next, remove the lag screws which secure the center support bracket to the header. In the trade, we normally use an impact wrench and an extended 7/16 inch nut driver or socket. In this video, notice that the end bearing plates are already installed. Confirm that the center of the bearing is 3 3/8 inches from the header. This is called the center line from the header, and this center line needs to match the center line of the winder. In order to mount the winder the correct height from the door, you will also need to determine the center line of the shaft from the top of the door. To do this, position one end of a level in the center of the end bearing. Raise or lower the other end to center the bubble in the level, and mark the header. Next, measure from the top of the door to this mark. Usually, this surface is uneven, and you can measure from the highest point of the door or from the lower groove. Either is fine as long as you measure from the same part of the door in the next step. In this video, we are measuring from the lower groove. The measurement on this door is 12 7/16 of an inch. Check the measurement at the other end as well. If the measurements differ, average the measurements to get an accurate center line from the top of the door to the center of the shaft above the door. This will assure that the shaft is straight and parallel to the top of the door. Move your ladder to the center of the door. Locate the lower groove of the top section and measure 12 7/16 inches from the top of the door to the header. Mark the location. If an opener rail is in the way, you can move a foot or so to either side. This is where the center of the shaft will be when the bracket is installed. On this door, we had to install extra wood to the header to support the winder bracket. Without this support, the torque could cause the winder to loosen and the springs to unwind. For safety and for an installation that will last the life of the door, it is absolutely essential that the ATL winder bracket be firmly secured to the header. To minimize the possibility of error, extend the mark with a level. The bottom of the S3 winder bracket is 3 1/4 inches below the center line of the shaft. To mark the location for the bottom of the bracket, measure and mark 3 1/4 inches below the shaft center line. The manufacturer's instructions show 3 3/4 inches, but 3 1/4 inches is more accurate. Extend the mark with a level. You'll mount the bottom of the bracket on this line. Notice the designation for the top of the winder bracket. Position the bottom of the bracket even with the line, plumb the winder, and mark for drilling. Since most of the torque pulls the bottom of the winder, we secure the bracket with 2 screws on the bottom, and these need to be in different grains of the wood. The top of the bracket is normally secured with only 1 screw. Recheck the hole marks on the bracket to assure it will be plumb when secured. To minimize the risk of wood splitting, pre-drill the holes. Also keep screws at least 1/2 inch from the sides and 2 inches from the top or bottom of the header boards or spring pads. And slide the winder onto the end of the shaft. Make sure you position the bracket so the top will be positioned as it was before. Slide the winder to the center of the shaft and position it next to the door. Reposition your ladder closer to the door, and lift the shaft above the ladder. Move the ladder again closer to the door, and raise both ends of the shaft above the horizontal tracks on both sides. Slide the left end of the shaft into the end bearing plate. Next, slide the shaft to the left just far enough to allow room for sliding the right end of the shaft into the end bearing plate. Slide the shaft into the right end bearing plate just enough so that both ends of the shaft remain in the end bearings. Position the bracket in place. Confirm that the bracket is plumb. Secure the bracket to the header. Adjust as needed. Be careful not to damage the winder. Recheck to confirm the bracket is plumb. If the tube is straight, you should be able to look into one end of the tube and see the hole at the other end. It is now time to install the remaining torsion hardware. Beginning at the left end of the door, find the cable drum with a red marking. Loosen the set screws. Find the spring with a red marking on the winding cone. The red cable drum goes with a red winding cone of the spring. This is a right wind spring, and it goes on the left side of the winder. Loosen the set screws. Torsion assemblies with springs mounted in the center get only one bearing. Fit the bearing inside the stationary cone so you'll know how it goes on the shaft. Climb the ladder. Slide the shaft to the right a foot or so. Install the bearing first. Position it so that it will fit inside the stationary cone of the spring. Slide on the bearing and then the spring, with the stationary cone first. Slide the bearing into the cone and slide the spring toward the center bracket. Install the cable drum with a red mark and set screws facing inside. Next, slide the left end of the shaft into the left end bearing and continue sliding it until the right end of the shaft slides out of the right end bearing. Notice that the shaft bounces for a few seconds. Go to the right side and loosen the set screws in the cable drum. Notice that the black mark on the cable drum matches the black mark on the winding cone of the spring. This is a left wind spring. Loosen the set screws in the winding cone. Feel the surface inside the winding cone and drum to ensure they will slide freely onto the shaft. Reposition the ladder and slide the spring onto the shaft. Check to confirm that the spring is left wind. This side does not get a bearing. Only one bearing is needed because a single bearing is sufficient to prevent the shaft from wearing on the bracket. Slide the spring onto the shaft and toward the winder bracket. Slide the cable drum onto the shaft. Slide the right end of the shaft into the right end bearing plate and move the shaft until the end is flush with the right side of the bearing. Go to the left end of the door and measure the amount of shaft extending beyond the left bearing. On this shaft, the distance is 6 inches. To center the shaft between the bearings, slide the shaft 3 inches to the right. Many installers use 3 or 4 fingers to gauge this distance. Now the shaft is centered with 3 inches extending beyond the bearing at each end. Next, slide the cable drum to the left until it touches the race of the bearing. On this side, you'll first tighten the set screws and then install the cable. On the right side, you'll install the cable first and then tighten the set screws. Before installing the cable in the drum, finger tighten the set screws until the screws meet the tube, and then tighten each screw 1/2 turn with a wrench. On heavier doors, weighing over 200 pounds, it's usually better to add an extra 1/4 turn to each set screw, as we show here. The set screws create indentations in the shaft to secure the drum. Check to make sure the cable drum is against the bearing. Now you will install the cable. Bend the end of the cable 90 degrees as shown, and insert the cable and tip into the slot of the drum. Check to make sure the cable is not sticking outside the edge of the drum. Wind the cable around the outside groove of the drum as you turn the shaft and drum downward. Continue gripping and twisting the drum and shaft to keep the cable tight. Vice grip the shaft with the top tight against the jamb or header. The cable should be tight. Test it by plucking the cable. It should vibrate. Confirm once again that the right wind spring is on the left side and slide the spring toward the winder, being careful not to damage it. Go to the right side and check the cable to make sure it's free, that it is connected to the bottom fixture, that it is not stuck under the door, and that it is free from bottom all the way to the top. A common mistake is that often one of the cables wraps around one of the track brackets. This will prevent the door from opening when you're finished. Before installing the cable, check the shaft to make sure the left drum is against the bearing by sliding the shaft as far to the left as you can. This will eliminate a number of possible problems. As we did on the left side, bend the end of the cable. On this side, instead of tightening the set screws first and then installing the cable, you'll install the cable first and then tighten the set screws. Insert the end of the cable in the drum and rotate the drum to wrap the cable around the outer groove of the drum. Continue twisting and gripping the drum to keep the cable tight. Tap the end of the shaft once more to assure the left drum is against the race of the bearing. Press the right drum against the bearing. While twisting the right drum to keep the cable tight, finger tighten both set screws until each touches the shaft. Next, tighten each set screw 3/4 turns while continuing to pull down on the drum to keep the cable tight. Check the tension on the cable and check the shaft to see that it doesn't slide horizontally. This will prevent a number of problems. It is now time to secure the stationary cones to the winder. We begin with the left side. Notice that there are 6 threaded holes on this side. Notice also the mounting plate that is shaped similar to the stationary cone. The cone will be bolted to this plate. Before assembling the hardware, lubricate the bearing. Align the cone holes with the bolt holes. Install and finger tighten one of the 3/8 inch by 3/4 inch red head bolts in the hole that is closer to the header. Lift the spring and shaft with your left hand and twist the end of the spring until the hole aligns. Insert and finger tighten the other bolt. Gently tighten both bolts with a 7/16 inch socket or other type of wrench. Then tighten both bolts. £18 of pull on each bolt should be adequate. Notice that on the right side of the winder there are only 2 holes, and these are part of the mounting plate. Notice also that the end of the spring wire points down if you turn the spring so the end faces you. Notice also that this is a left wind spring on the right side of the bracket. Align the holes of the cone with the holes of the mounting plate. Slide the spring toward the bracket, lift up on the end of the spring, and align the holes so the bolt fits. Insert and finger tighten the top bolt. Next, lift the spring, insert and finger tighten the bottom bolt until the cone is flush against the mounting plate. Tighten both bolts with a wrench as you did on the left side. The next step is probably the most difficult. The springs need to be stretched and the set screws tightened before winding the springs. To do this, you'll need to first calculate the amount of stretch for each spring. If you know the wire size and door height, you can simply refer to this chart to determine the distance to stretch the spring. Otherwise, you'll need to measure coils on one or both springs. On a 7-foot high door, the stretch is wire size times 8 plus 1/4 inch. On 8-foot high doors, the stretch is wire size times 9 plus 1/4 inch. There are a number of ways to measure. One is to attach masking tape to the spring. Cut between the coils on one end and mark the tops of 8 coils on the tape. On 8-foot high doors, mark 9 coils. Mark and count from the left side of the first coil to the right side of the 8th coil. Cut the other end and you'll have the width of 8 coils. You can also measure the 8 coils. Here we get 1 and 11/16 inches. Transfer the tape to the shaft just beyond the winding cone. Measuring will confirm the 1 and 11/16 inches. To this 8 coil measurement, you'll measure and mark at an extra 1/4 inch. This will provide the total 1 and 15/16 inches needed to properly stretch the spring. Remove the tape from the right side and stick it on the shaft next to the cone on the left side. Since the springs in this video are a matched pair of .207 wire, the other side will need to be stretched the same distance. Mark the shaft 1/4 inch beyond the tape and remove the tape. Now it's time to stretch the springs. There are a number of ways to do this. Here are 4. The first is to stretch by hand. You can probably do this if the springs are made of smaller wire, up to .225. Stretch the spring. If you have trouble with the cone staying on the mark, finger tighten the set screws. Push the end of the spring again, and tighten the first set screw 1/2 to 3/4 turns after the tip of the set screw meets the shaft. Tighten the second set screw as you did the first. A second way to stretch the spring is to insert a 1/2 inch rod, winding bar, or a long socket extension into the winding cone. Pull the bottom of the bar toward the center of the door. Tap the top of the bar just under the winding cone with a winding bar. Notice that if you stop pulling the bottom of the bar toward the center of the door, the spring loses its stretch. You can also tap the top of the bar with a hammer while pulling the bottom of the bar toward the center of the door. On heavier doors with spring wire sizes larger than .225, a third option for stretching the spring is to use a clamp, such as the one shown here. You can vice grip the shaft a few inches from the cone, insert a 1/2 inch rod into the cone, and squeeze the top of the rod and cone toward the vice grip, while pulling the bottom of the rod toward the center of the door. This may require a 2-step process, which includes tightening a set screw to allow you to readjust the spacing of the vice grip on the shaft. After you reach the mark, continue pulling the bottom of the bar toward the center of the door to maintain the stretch. Then tighten the set screws. A fourth option for the larger .262 to .295 wire springs is to use a come-along or cable winch to stretch the spring. Hook the end of the cable to the horizontal track and insert a 1/2 inch rod into the winding cone. Next, pull on the top of the bar while gripping the bottom of the bar and keeping it plumb. A short socket extension will not work, because pulling on it causes the cone to pitch and bind on the shaft. Tighten the set screws. Go to the spring on the other side, locate the mark made earlier, and stretch the spring to the mark. Tighten the set screws. It's now time to wind the springs. But first, you need to vice grip the track on one side above the middle roller to avoid a possible accident or injury. Next, mark the stationary cone and orange rim so you can count the number of turns you wind the springs. To wind the springs, use a 7/16 inch nut driver or socket in a drill, not an impact wrench. Set the drill on low speed and set it to slip if there is too much torque. This will also protect your wrists from possible injury. Also set the drill to wind counterclockwise to wind the springs. Wind the spring by turning the 7/16 inch bolt head at the bottom of the winder. Count the number of turns as you wind the spring, 1 for each time the black mark on the stationary cone passes the mark on the orange rim. Notice also that the stationary cones turn downward. If they turn upward, you have your drill set the wrong direction. You're also turning the cones as if you were trying to unscrew them from the springs. This is counterintuitive, but it's the only way that works. If a spring comes off the cones at about 6 turns, you've probably mounted the springs on the wrong side of the winder, or you're winding the springs the wrong direction. If the door starts to rise before completing the number of turns, you may have miscounted the number of turns, or the springs may be too strong. The vice grip on the track should prevent the door from rising more than 3 inches. A second safety is the vice grip secured to the end of the shaft. This limits the lift to about 8 inches. Also, if the spring binds, as you see here, it may not have enough stretch. Notice that the middle of the spring rises and the coils are very tight. Exercise caution because continuing to wind the springs could destroy the winder. After winding the springs, the coils in each spring should be flexible and loose, not tight. If the springs snake when you finish winding them, they may have too much stretch. After winding the springs, check to make sure the door balances. First, check the door and remove any tools or parts that could fall and hit you. Check to make sure the door stays on the floor without holding it by hand. If it does, remove the vice grip that is secured to the track on the right side of the door. Remove the vice grip at the left end of the shaft. Check the door to make sure that it balances properly. The door should stay on the floor when closed. If you open the door halfway, it should stay without holding it. When you open the door all the way, it should stay without holding it open. Check to make sure the door seals evenly across the floor. The last step is to secure the winding mechanism. On the right side of the winder toward the bottom, notice the locking slot just to the left of the red head bolt. On the left side, there are 4 3/8 inch threaded locking points. You need to identify the locking point on the left side that is closest to the locking slot on the right side. Using a ratchet wrench at a 7/16 inch socket, turn the winder bolt to align the nearest locking point to the locking slot. On this winder, we turn the socket counterclockwise to align the holes. Insert and finger tighten the locking bolt. Secure the bolt with the same 7/16 inch wrench. To prevent corrosion and possible premature breakage, lubricate each spring. The more viscous the oil, the longer it will last. I normally use 40 weight motor oil, but 10W40 will work. Squirt a stream of motor oil across the tops of the torsion springs and rub the oil into the coils. You can also use 3-in-1 oil or a spray lube. Do not oil the last inch of the springs where the wires wound around the cones. The springs might unwind from the cones in the future. Congratulations, you are now finished. Thank you for watching.